Welcome to the call, everyone. So this is the first of a weekly series where we're just going to go really deep on different topics. As this gets bigger and gets more people into it, we only get launched it with 1 day's notice. We're going to get a lot more deep into this, and it's going to be really, really fun, all the stuff we're going to cover. The main goal being trying to give trainers the best information possible to be able to get the best results with their clients, which are going to help, generate better businesses, but then also better quality coaches, because the quality of coaching generally sucks and we want to make it better and better. So let's get into this. And today we're going to be going over the thought process I use for rehab and movement. And I want to preface this with is that this is like a lot of this isn't necessarily in the scientific literature. It's a process of going through stuff that works with clients and taking all different types of the evidence-based approach. So not just like what a research paper says, but what my empirical experience is and what we've found other people have found from empirical evidence as well. And putting it all together gives you a much more comprehensive approach to your rehabilitative process, and then allows you to think about it in a way where it's not just like client X has saw Y. What do I need to do to fix that? We need to think about what client X has saw Y, but they also want to achieve goal A, B, C. How can we put all that together? And then all different factors that influence that. So it's going to be a lot of thinking. If you have questions, in the chat box, just because I've messed up my screen. I can't see anything at the moment, but they'll all be good. I'll just put that there. All right, cool. So first slide, biopsychosocial model. So when I look at injuries and look at pain and movement, this is the first lens that I'm going to go through. So each of the slides that we have are different lenses that we apply to the client as kind of like a framework of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as we go through. So biopsychosocial model, if you haven't heard of it before, it's a holistic approach that considers your biology, your psychology, and social factors in rehab and movement. And if you look at that chart there from Cholowicki et al. 2019, these are all the influences that pain have. Now, realistically, not one single person could influence all of those or understand all of those to the full extent that are needed to actually help someone. So it's about having an understanding that there's multiple factors that will lead to any kind of injury that someone has, and then looking at how you can take which one of those that you can actually take a meaningful effect of, and which ones you think may be very useful or very meaningful to your client at that time. So key components are your biology. So tissue healing, strength, mobility, biomechanics, all that type of fun stuff. One thing that I will say very much straight off the bat is with rehab stuff, a lot of time we think biomechanics and we forget about tissue. So we forget about the physiology. So this is where when you start understanding that stuff, if you can understand someone from a biomechanical point of view, and then you can start understanding the biology behind it and the physiology, you can then come up with really integrated approaches for training, nutrition, supplementation, and then also certain, I guess, we're going to call them activities that disrupt homeostasis in a positive way. So things like ice baths, saunas, all that kind of fun stuff, light, grounding, whatever. So understanding how the biology interflicts and interplays with the biomechanics allows you to get a much better outcome for your clients. So for example, if you had a disc pathology patient, if you were they had a disc injury, whatever happened, they're going to have a high degree of acute inflammation post. We all understand that, and that acute inflammation is pretty important because it drives healing factors and cytokines towards the affected tissue to help them heal. Post that, any kind of excessive inflammation is going to reduce the ability of the muscular tissue around that disc to help redirect that disc back into the central part. So looking at supplementation with fish oil, curcumin, any of the basic anti-inflammatories, looking at the impact of heat on it, all of those things will start to make a difference for how fast someone can come back from injury, but then also how strong they come back from injury. And the analogy I'll use for this one is a cast on your arm. You don't, like when the doctor says you've got a cast on your arm and you're going to have it on for 8 weeks, you don't fuck around with that. Some people do, and it doesn't really work out too well for them. But we have that on for that period of time because that is the length of time that it takes for a tissue to heal to its full extent. So I will always look at tissue healing rates, so tendons, ligaments, bones, etc., whatever the affected tissue is, in how fast we can get someone through their rehab place, how we can explain that to them, and then potentially, and this is the potential thing, and this is where you start to see all the cool stuff, how if you address it from a multifactorial perspective, which is what all of us on this call kind of do, that you can actually get things healing a lot faster than what it is. Now, with the other stuff that goes into this, so we're going to keep disc in our mind just there. So most disc pathologies take 4 to 6 weeks to basically return back to normal in most cases in the absence of any kind of rehab because the disc nucleus starts to re-centralize itself. So we're just going to keep 4 to 6 weeks as our kind of like our marker there. Now, in psycho is our fear avoidance behaviors, motivation, and perception of pain. So a lot of the time, how we move will, or the fear that we have of movement around that will cause us to overcontract these muscles to recognize any kind of sensation as pain, and that's going to cause a setback in someone's rehab, primarily from a psychosomatic approach rather than an actual physiological disruption. So like the other day I saw, and I got very upset about it, Dylan coaching Six, getting him doing some heavy ass rows, which was really, really cool because Six had a little bit of a psychosomatic avoidance of doing some certain things. So doing some really good coaching, and actually a lot of the stuff that was done in that coaching involved getting rid of Six's fear avoidance behaviors, giving him different sensory feedback from the belt, giving him a different level of motivation, change his perception of pain. He was able to continue that and go into the next level of rehab, which is back to performance, which is the end goal. So those types of things here are really, really important. And we'll find that with our clients, each different client will have a different threshold for the psychological behaviors. So some clients may get like a slight niggle in their leg, for example, or their knee, and they won't squat or lunge for like a month. Whereas some clients can literally get their leg blown off or get shot, and they'll just go and do squats that day. That is going to be very, very individualized. And what you generally find with that is working with that person in that particular framework leads to the best outcomes. For example, what I would do if someone who's the kind of person who's like gets shot in the leg and they still keep on going, I would actually just work on technique reinforcement for a particular person and looking at getting the physiology so they can improve their performance. For someone who's a little bit, more sensitive to pain, I would be looking at creating a much more supportive environment for them and actually pushing them a little bit further by, and this sounds really bad, but lying to them about the load deadlifting. Because they'll then have, it'll change their perception of what they're capable of, which is going to give them that confidence, which will allow them to move over pain a lot faster. And then finally, sociology, lifestyle, work demand support system. I start looking at all this kind of stuff really, really early on. So if it's a trainer, for example, and they get disc pathology, the first thing I tell them to do is to stop getting their clients' weights. The reason I want them to not get their clients' weights is, well, there's 2 reasons. It's kind of like we want to make sure that their clients are self-sufficient enough to actually get their own weights and put them away. I think it's a pretty good gym practice. But also when they do that, it's that constant flexion, rotation, lumbar disc pathology model kind of in action there. So if we got an activity that is going to totally shortcut what we're doing in the gym, it's kind of like shooting ourselves in the foot. So we look at that. If we look at the lifestyle and work demands, what we can see with that particular client is they are going to, in a lot of cases, they work a lot of hours, they don't sleep very much, blah, blah, blah. They might be in a chair all the time. How can we change, not even change their lifestyle factors, but what are the mitigating strategies that we can use to help someone with those particular things? Okay, so if someone's in a desk the whole time and they got disc pathology, a lot of us just think about the rehab and what we're going to do in the gym. We need to think about the ergonomics. We need to think about their diet. We need to think about these things here. And with each of those strategies, then apply a coach-centered framework to allow the client to do the thing. So this is like when I have an injury, just to bring it back to the bigger picture. With a client, I look at the entirety of these things and just basically spend a lot of time talking to them. The talking does a couple of things. It creates trust with the therapist or the practitioner. It makes them feel at ease with me. They develop a little bit of a rapport and they start telling more shit that goes on. And I always use this as a selling tool because then you end up selling something else or they sell a friend. That time in that initial conversation discussing all these factors that are in here is kind of like one of the most important parts of the rehab process. You don't need to understand them all and how to treat them all. You just need to understand that they're there and that let's pick the ones that have the biggest follow-on effects to the others. So the disc, just getting Six not to get his clients' weights, even though he ignored me, is really important. From there, we move to load management. And this is kind of like the poster child in the world for rehab at the moment. And to be perfectly frank, it bothers me because it simplifies things to the fact of just do less. And it's sometimes that's not really applicable. Sometimes it's like if you got a high performance athlete, doing less is really not the ideal strategy that you can have. And just by doing less, it kind of ignores any of the biomechanical etiologies that are underlying the issues. Okay, so I see a lot of people just do less or just change the exercise. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It's just like letting the arm bleed out. So if we look at load management from a proper definition, just so we speak the same language. We want to balance training, recovery, and stress to optimize performance and minimize injury risk. We all kind of get that. You don't go from squatting 40 kilos to squatting 100 kilos next week. Like, it's not that complex to get our head around. We see the most common injury that we see is purely a function of load management, and this is purely shin splints from running. Like, how many people recently, because running's become popular now, I'm not really sure what's led to that, but how many people decide they're going to start running 10Ks and they start getting shin splints and stuff like that? It's a load management issue. It's not their biomechanics. They just simply can't handle the load that they need to handle when they're running. So when we're looking at someone from this perspective, I do consider this though straight away, and I just don't think that the load itself is the problem. So acute versus chronic workload, progressive overload and overtraining, monitoring fatigue and recovery. I'm going to argue that most people are going to be actually probably not doing enough in terms of their performance. If we're talking general pop, there'll be some athletes that are doing way too much, which is fairly understandable. And the common link between both of those is going to be an under recovery process. So under recovery, meaning they're not getting adequate sleep, they're not getting adequate nutrients, they're not doing activities that will help promote their parasympathetic response versus their sympathetic response. So I look at this as load management as a sympathetic, parasympathetic overload system. Are you more parasympathetic? Are you more sympathetic? So case study, client got 4 or 5 wedge fractures in their thoracic spine, lumbar disc bulge, cervical disc bulge, Barrett's esophagus, sleep apnea, and fatty liver disease. That's one client I'm currently working with right now. Work, no job. Cool. Oh, 2 days a week, but the job is just purely for enjoyment for her out of anything. She zero exercise, doesn't have any sleep. Hers is certainly not an acute workload or a chronic workload issue. From her, it's purely an under recovery, and she's incredibly sympathetically driven. So from her, anything to actually increase her sympathetic tone, parasympathetic tone, pardon me, actually gives her a noticeable decrease in day-to-day symptoms. She also has arthritis running through all her joints of her hands and her feet. And anytime we give her parasympathetic building activities, she notices an acute decrease in arthritic symptoms within 1 to 2 days. So for her, the load management is a little bit different. For someone who is a performing athlete who's under load, so takeaway for that is if your clients have a load management issue and they're stressed out all the time and they're not athletes who are training, multiple times a week, they're purely under recovery. The other flip side of the load management issue is that it's not just the volume of the load, it's how we handle the load. And that's something that a lot of people kind of miss when they've kind of try and discount biomechanics as a factor and just trying to go purely to, the body adapts to, shitty lifting positions, etc. So let's use a thought experiment. Let's use Michael as the thought experiment here because he's tall. There's a reason for it, Mikey. Besides you, very handsome. If Mike's doing Romanian deadlifts, he could probably do, let's say 100 for 6. Like, as a simple mathematical formula. He can do 100 for 6, he feels okay. His disc can handle that load. His lumbar erectors, his facet joints, pars joints, all that stuff can handle load. If he does that with a rounded back and he's not doing it like a controlled Jefferson curl, he's just doing a shitty ass form deadlift with very low load going through the actual muscular structures, and he's driving it all through the skeletal structures, is his load management going to be as high? His ability to tolerate load is going to be high. No, it's going to be far lower because he's directing the load on the passive structures, which just do not have the loading capacities of active structures. Muscle can take more load, and they distribute that load far better than putting a joint into a shitty position. So anyone who says that load management, the body just adapts to, say, knees caving in all the time and, lifting with shitty posture or shitty movement patterns, whatever, it does adapt, but is it the adaptation we want to drive? That's also the second part of that question. So I've had arguments with EPs, exercise physiologists, who say their job is not to cue the client, not to correct the form, just make sure they manage their load and they have fun and they enjoy the workout. My argument is why you're getting paid at that point. Like, imagine going to a coach and they don't actually help you improve your form. And I find it quite cognitive, it's got a high load of cognitive dissonance because there's no actual athletic activity besides lifting weights where professional coaches say form doesn't matter. There really isn't. If you go to BJJ, you're taught how to do the movement in a very particular way. If you do, I'm talking about recreational weightlifting. I'm not talking about Olympic weightlifting because there's very solid technique requirements there. If you don't go to, say, learn how to shoot a basketball or throw a javelin or a shot put or whatever it is, or serve a tennis racket without particular biomechanical principles being formed, and technique principles, because it becomes a matter of performance at that point. And I think all our clients, when they come to us, they don't go just to not get injured when they lift weights and have someone manage their load. They generally go to get better. And I think it's doing a massive disservice to the industry, this push towards load management, without having an awareness of biomechanics and all the other fun stuff that we spend a lot of time on, because load management is the only key to success. And you'll see this happen more and more, where people will argue this, and I think it's one of those arguments that's never going to go away, probably because the optimal lifting bros have got us, like, isolating the lower lumbar portion of our iliac lat for each exercise rather than just doing a goddamn lat pull down. They both have their places, but this has gone too far. So load management, our takeaway from here is we want to look at the client situation in their general population. We look at the overall load that they're lifting, okay, and their overall recovery. Generally, it's going to be systemic under recovery and systemic parasympathetic weakness, sympathetic dominance. So they're not getting any kind of recovery processes. If it's an athlete, we want to look at the actual load, but then also look at the biomechanics underneath that and see if we can optimize how they handle that. And for a lot of athletes, like in the ACL world, that will be deceleration. In the meniscus world, it'll be resisting rotation. It will torque at the knee. How do they handle that load? You can kind of start to look at, when you have this framework, what are the key movements or the key ways that an athlete has to manage load that we need to get them stronger at, because each activity will have different ways of doing that. Netball, as a simple example, it's deceleration load. But netballers don't need to have explosive verticals. They don't jump for shooting balls. They don't dunk the ball. Having a good vertical works, but they don't need to be exceptional at it. Their most important thing to keep them on the field is having good deceleration mechanics and be able to handle that load, as we know from all netballers getting screwed up ankles and knees. Now, from here, once we've done these two steps, and I've kind of analyzed, like, got a global picture, we want to look at, cool, where can we start getting some really root level foundational stuff for the client to give them something to do so they feel better immediately. And I think that is, I know Dylan's talked about before in his stuff. I've talked about getting client a fast win is always fantastic. It's why you would give someone a crash diet, like at the beginning, to lose a couple of kilos. If you can get a client a fast win, you get a higher degree of buy-in. So from an injury and pain and movement perspective, the joint by joint approach and the other stuff is going to get you the fastest buy-in. So you figure out overall where someone is, what they need, where the loads manage, what biopsychosocial things they have, and then we go straight to biomechanics. And the joint by joint for most people is really simple. I'll reiterate it slightly, so everyone who watches this who may not be familiar with it gets it. The body is basically a stacked series of joints. It has some exceptions to the rule, but as a general rule of thumb, the foot needs stability, ankle mobility, knee stability, hip mobility, lumbar stability, thoracic mobility, sternoclavicular joint stability, glenohumeral joint mobility, scapular needs stability, elbow needs stability, wrist is mobility, and hand is stability. And the lower neck, lower cervical spine is stability, upper cervical spine is mobility. So a lot of the time, just when giving people stuff to do from that is, for their particular orthopedic injury or their particular pain symptom, where are they lacking in this thing, in this formula? Where do they need more stability that they don't have? Where do they lack mobility? So with my client with the wedge fractures, okay, interesting. That's a sign of excessive thoracic flexion done under time. She's stuck in thoracic flexion. She does not have enough mobility in the thoracic spine at all. And she's that long-term being in that really hunched position, having weight come down her every time she has an impact on the ground. So 4 to 7 times ground reaction force when she walks. Plus she's not particularly strong, so it's probably higher. She's impacting her thoracic spine. That's leading to a continual degradation of those wedge fractures because the actual biomechanics is driving it that way. So from her, we just drove some thoracic mobility for one session. And she was like, oh, that's stiff as shit. And it hurt more. And I was like, cool. Does the pain go away when you finish? Yep. Cool. But then we're not aggravating any structures. It's just discomfort going through new ranges of motion. Next day, she's like, oh, my back and shoulders actually feel really good. She got like a 15-degree increase in glenohumeral flexion. So she's like, this is happy days. She got a fast win is the story here. So anytime using this type of formula, you can get a fast win for someone. It makes the client buy in. If you have a client who, has low back pain on a squat, check their hip for mobility. They're going to lack one of two things. It's going to be internal rotation mobility or flexion mobility, probably a combo of both. So if we can get the client to, do some hip internal rotation drills and hip flexion drills, all of a sudden they go in their Romanian deadlift, they feel better. It's a fast win. These aren't the end result that we're after, but it's our way to get our buy-in, which is such an important concept. We see it all the time with selling any form of coaching. This is why I still love being able to assess someone in real life. I don't really have that luxury too often, but the more that you can do it, the better off it is, because you can actually apply these things really, really quickly. You can still do it over Zoom, but it's a pain in the ass. Real life is the winner here because you can actually get your hands on the person and let them do the thing. So that's a joint by joint. So just to recap from the beginning again, global assessment biopsychosocial, start looking at load management for individual assessment. Then we look into the joint by joint approach. And now we're going to look at how they actually absorb and create force as a general rule of thumb. So once we've assessed the standard joint mechanics and like where they are from that perspective, understanding more so the movement slings and rather than the fascial lines. I think the fascial lines, they have a lot of empirical results behind them. They don't have a ton of really solid evidence, but I think they're still useful. Really gives you a nice framework. So this is the framework that I like to run it for, to see based on the movement and needs analysis the client has. And I'll come back to the netballer and I'll bring in a disc bulge so we can get some context. So for the movement slings, that's how we create our movement. The fascial lines are how we absorb and dissipate our movement. Okay. Fascia doesn't really create a contractile force. It can under the influence of histamine, which is what you call a Dupuytren's contracture, when people get their hands going like this. And that's a biological, physiological dysfunction. So we're not going to stress about that conversation today. With our movement slings, this is how we create our movement. So our anterior sling with our obliques and our adductors, that helps us create the anterior rotation and gait. We're coming forward. Our posterior oblique sling gives us that hip extension and lat to help us move forward. Our lateral sling allows us our pelvis to elevate so we don't swing our foot and hit the ground and trip over. And our deep longitudinal sling allows us to take that force transfer from our heel hitting the ground. When our heel hits the ground when we walk, we get the transmission of muscle up the anterior tibialis, the peroneus longus, into the biceps femoris, and that goes into the thoracolumbar fascia. If our core works correctly, we get that to actually create more kinetic energy to create a forward moving thing. Otherwise, it goes up the back and our neck muscles actually stop that force shaking our head. It's a whole lecture in itself, the deep longitudinal sling. But if we get these slings working right, then we can actually see some really positive ways in someone moves. So I would use this as an example. Someone does a pull for the deadlift and their back goes in like that first phase. Cool. I'd be looking at their posterior oblique sling as a big part of that, because that's going to give stability at the sacroiliac joint, and the glute max and the lat are really going to help stabilize the lumbar vertebrae. So I'd be looking at there and seeing how they kind of work out, because if I know someone has hurt themselves in an acceleration or creating a movement phase, then I'm going to be starting looking at movement slings to see if there's any form of dysfunction. There's multiple tests for that. If someone has hurt themselves in a deceleration thing, I would be looking at a fascial line type situation there. So if someone's got pain going down the stairs, for example, I'd be looking at, all right, cool, what's the connective tissue like on their rectus femoris and their quad muscles? Because that's the deceleration force that's pulling down. So very easy test to do. If someone has knee pain, as an example, if it's going upstairs, do a couple of glute exercises. Like it doesn't really matter. It just needs to be anything that gets the glutes more electrically active. They're going to feel a decrease in pain. Anytime someone has pain going down the stairs, get them to quickly foam roll out their quad and do a little like kneeling quad stretch. You'll find that straight away they get a decrease in pain. Can both of them be involved together? Yep, absolutely. Happens all the time. I'm so glad that's still hot. There's nothing worse than cold black coffee. It's just heartbreaking. So when I look at this type of stuff, I want to see, what's happening with someone in each one of these systems as more of our long-term result. Reason for that, and as an overall view, is there's only really 3 functional movements in my perspective. I don't think squat, bend, push, pull, twist are functional movements, because like you don't really need them to survive, in terms of you don't need a full hip squat to survive anymore. I think the only functional movements, with the goal of function being not dying, breathing, eating, and walking. So being able to ambulate towards something. I'm not particularly stressed about like training a squat there. And if we see someone get a movement dysfunction, it will affect their gait. Probably won't affect their eating, I hope not. And their breathing is going to be a big thing for holding that in place. So any movement dysfunction that we see, one of the biggest things is to restore gait back to a nice level, because gait is such a deep subsystem that we have neurologically. The better we get gait working, the better everything works. This is why with one of the protocols I recommend for all DISC patients, which is it's a takeoff of the McGill Big Three, but I call it the squat stability protocol. I always try and do a 10-minute walk after, because once we've rebuilt these sling systems, there's an exercise for the posterior oblique, there's an anterior oblique, there's a lateral sling system exercise in there, and there's a deep longitudinal sling exercise in there. What we do is get the client to go for a 10-minute walk, because it integrates those systems into gait. People think I'm doing it for sunlight or the steps or for the parasympathetic beta oxidative, the PBO walks or whatever. In most cases, it's actually to get these movement slings integrated. So anytime we have a corrective exercise, what we've done is we've created a window of opportunity, which we then load. Most people do it with the way we load with weights in the gym, which is totally fine. And it works. I love it. I use it all the time myself. But having a walk is a really powerful way to reintegrate that system in. And you can use this with DISC patients who want to deadlift that day. They'll get a significant decrease in pain symptoms simply because that walking will start to integrate these muscles far more effectively than any other movement tool that you can have, because it's so primitive. Anyone has a question? Let me know, just ask. I see a carrot on the screen. That is awesome. That's super cute. But yeah, these are really important to start addressing. Now from here, and this is where I start looking at the long-term stuff for people, is postural deviations and their impact. And with postural deviations, there's a lot of arguments now that say posture doesn't matter. And the argument, it makes sense. Like there's 7 billion people in the world, they'll have a slightly different posture, and not all 7 billion people have pain. We can all agree with that, yeah? It's a pretty simple thing to make. So from that perspective, we can't associate something like having excessive thoracic kyphosis is associated with pain in the global population. Hey, Rose. But we can say that it does impact certain individuals. Okay, there are individuals in anterior pelvic tilt that cause them pain, because as soon as you remove them out of anterior pelvic tilt, they're out of the pain. Same with posterior pelvic tilt, upper cross, lower cross, scoliosis, all that type of stuff. So we look at this and we take this all the way back to the tool of load management. If someone is stuck in excessive thoracic kyphosis, when they're doing their overhead pressing, they decide to do some overhead pressing or reaching overhead, they will have a lower capacity for load management than someone who's got their thoracic spine can go through a normal extension pattern. It's pretty easy to work out. We just do the test where we round our back and reach overhead, and we have the mobility of the Hunchback of Notre Dame. We see that happening really, really quickly. So that's so funny. That's something that I really look at all the time, people. For a while, I kind of discount its importance, but what we want to do is start looking at from how would that have a long-term impact on someone's ability to manage the load and the exercises that they do. And the cool thing about this is it's been written so much about, like there's so much info on it. Like you can actually put it into ChatGPT and it tells you pretty well with this type of stuff. Like being stuck in excessive lumbar lordosis will drive anterior translation of the femoral head. That will mean anyone who's going into hip flexion, they will struggle to go all the way into hip flexion because they're already in an anterior pelvic tilt. They will have less hip flexion room available when they go down into the bottom of the squat. They'll get like some kind of anterior pinching of a hip, or they'll get the lumbar posterior pelvic tilt in the butt wink because they need to create more room for their hip joint to move. So what we do with this is really, really simple. And this kind of goes into the next point anyway, or the next slide, sorry. We actually bias our training interventions towards favoring strengthening the muscles that we know are weak from this particular framework. Okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And in terms of looking at it from a like aesthetic point of view, strengthening the muscles that are weak from this framework generally works well anyway. Like if the thoracic kyphosis is excessive, strengthening the mid-back and the rhomboids and the muscles that retract the scapula lead to a more aesthetic posture anyway. So what we need to kind of be aware of is mobility drills and restrictions, which will always find same with the joint by joint. Strengthening the weak areas, which we'll find will react with the joint by joint, retraining the movement pattern they can't do. It's a simple process, this one. This one is the most simple process. And the reason why I like to kind of bring it up and still use it with people is just because it's simple and it's a little bit old school doesn't mean it doesn't work. And I think that's one of the things that happens a lot in the rehab world these days when people get these new discoveries is they throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because there may not be like total evidence basically suggesting this, but then you've also got exercise schools of thought where people are blowing into a balloon to increase intracostal pressure to reduce pain. Like there's zero evidence for that, but it just looks smarter. And I don't think you necessarily, the impact of the choice shouldn't isn't determined by how intelligent or how complicated it is. Sometimes the really simple stuff where we can get the client the fast win and that we can do at scale en masse in group classes is a very, very valuable tool for people. So never underestimate this stuff. It can be really, really useful. And I think that it's really undervalued in what we're doing these days. And again, I've discounted it because it was probably too simple. I liked more complex approaches, but I got better results when I was simple. Adding all this stuff like the biopsychosocial model and load management purely enhanced that. Now from here, and these are the like just the frameworks that I go through. I'll actually go through all these mental models when I'm assessing a client to see what I can give them straight away. Because they all have value. You just don't want to do everything for everyone. You pick the one that will do most, which we'll talk about at the end. So the Vajanda approach, Vladimir Janda, Czechoslovakian physiotherapist, had polio, kind of wanted to cure himself, I think was his whole idea. He came out with like upper cross, lower cross syndrome and how you can use it for muscle imbalances. You know, it still is very useful to this day. Like, is it research back the whole way? No, it's not, but it's been done in clinical practice for like since very, very long time, like 1950s, I think. And it's worked for thousands and thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions. So I'm still not going to discount it straight away because new research says, oh, there's no proof that this actually affects. And with the research saying it doesn't have an effect, this is the same research that, we're using for hypertrophy studies now, where we think the only way to do hypertrophy is lifting in sets of 4 to 8, and we're overly fatigued. The research doesn't really add up with what we've seen in real life. So we've been evidence-based. It's like research is here, your own principles are here, and then what other people are doing are kind of here. It all works together. So the Junjo approach, this is again another one to give your clients quick wins, and you can create a really simple way of learning it for yourself. Learn which muscles are tonic and prone to tightness and which muscles are phasic and prone to weakness, and make sure that your exercise programs basically cater for that. Okay. And I'll tell you exactly how you can do it in 1 second. The first way you can do it is you can do it with stretching. Basic old static stretching. Again, this rehab thing is my thought process, so I can say what I want. Old school static stretching, Michael's just gone to space. Old school static stretching is still cool. It's still useful. It's totally undervalued for people who are in acute pain, who are particularly a little bit older, who don't have the load capacity to do loaded stretching. Should they move to loaded stretching? Absolutely. But giving a loaded stretch to someone who's like 68 years old with like multiple wedge fractures in their spine wouldn't be ideal for that person. She simply couldn't handle it. A basic hip flexor stretch, right? She can handle that. And the thing is, the more deconditioned someone is, so us miss rehab, because we like what's cool, right? Like I've done it, I've fallen for the trap many times myself. The more deconditioned someone is, the more basic their approach can be, and the more beneficial it is. It's a really, really good thing to do. So if I had an athlete that was elite, right, I probably wouldn't give them a static stretch. They'd probably get bored. Their nervous system's too fast and too reactive, and they learn too quickly. And they're so strong that it won't be useful. But giving them something like someone who's like, 75, standing calf stretch, they'll love it. They'll feel amazing from it. And that's kind of like what we're really after. Everyone's so worried about being correct and like making sure what's accurate that we're actually less concerned with actually helping the client. I'd rather help the client than be like considered scientifically correct in my approach or do something that's not evidence-based. Like if the client gets better, that's the evidence that I care about right now for this. So this is why I still recommend looking at this stuff and doing stuff to actually help clients with that. Now, the next way that you can actually train someone this and actually apply it to the load stretching model, which again, I use every single day and I think it works. And I think people should use it, is not that slide. Training in different muscle lengths. Now, this is a piss take photo of Mike Israel trying to train his biceps in the lengthened position by slightly dislocating his shoulder and taking it to the fullest. He's now at the point where his bench, I kid you not, he's actually moving to upside down to get more of a stretch in the biceps, which is a total gross misappropriation of what actually happens. But what we can do is we can apply the gender approach to our strength training anyway, and the postural deviations to our strength training approach. This also applies to load management, so I'll bring it all together very soon. Training in different muscle lengths. So if a muscle's in a tight muscle or a tonic muscle and it's prone to tightness, okay, we do lengthened position strength training because we're doing loaded stretching at the end range of motion. Generally, I add a nice little isometric pause at the end range of motion to create that isometric strength that creates joint stability at extreme range of motion, extreme being for that client. And something like, with the knees over toe guy, he does the front foot elevated split squat for his knee rehab and his hip flexor rehab for people. You know what? It takes the knee for like a longer range of motion. It takes the rec fem and the hip flexors and everything through a long range of motion. So for that, it's valid. That's why it works for a lot of people. It takes commonly shortened muscles and puts them in a lengthened position and forces them to adapt to that. And generally, if someone's got shortened muscles, okay, chronically shortened muscles, and they respond really well to the lengthened position stuff, it's probably a position they haven't been in for a very long period of time. So what you're doing is you're moving the load off a particular position that they're always in, and you're taking the load to a new position, which is effectively load management. You're taking the load off the overly affected tissue and putting it onto new fresh tissues, for lack of a better term. Fresh is going to be the one I use, to allow the client to feel better. Awesome. Now, for short position stuff, muscles that would come up as we test them in a neuromuscular perspective, and they would be underactive. Okay. We would train them in a short position. So like a CAS hip thrust or a glute bridge, for example, is purely a short position glute exercise. You don't get a stretch in the glute max in it because you don't get a full hip flexion moment, which is totally cool. But you can hold that isometric for like 2 to 3 seconds at the top position with a slight posterior pelvic tilt to increase the glutes, like general overall muscle tone, its ability to contract. It also gives them nice hypertrophy. It'll make it a more preferred muscle to create hip extension, which is its ideal point. Now, a lot of people, and this is where we'll kind of see where it kind of comes in here, we see it practically. When a lot of people start doing hip thrusts for the first time, they get a pump in their lower back and they don't really feel their glutes. The reason for that is from a neuromuscular gender perspective, they're generally stuck in lower cross syndrome, or they've got an anterior pelvic tilt, and they preferentially use their distal hamstrings, and which sounds really weird, but proximal hamstrings, and I knew it sounded weird for a reason, and their rectus spinae muscles to create hip extension, where their glutes are kind of like, no, we're not going to get involved. We're a bit tired today. We're not going to do it. And as soon as we kind of cue that person to have a posterior pelvic tilt, and we get them to actually start using the glutes to drive that end range hip extension, we get what's called the isometric carryover. And the isometric carryover is if I train a muscle here, like so I flex my arm and I train it hard and get really strong at 90 degrees, 90 degrees, Joel Seedman style, which is probably about there with Joel Seedman, but let's not pick on him too much. It's too easy. I'm going to get strong 10 degrees either way. If I train here, I'm going to get strong 10 degrees either way. So if I train at hip extension with my glute, like full hip extension, I'm going to get like a little bit more of strength getting my glute to be the prime hip extensor, 10 to 15 degrees into a slight hip flexion. So over a period of time, as I go through that and I get stronger and I use my glute to push that, range of motion towards the end, I start to get fatigued and it's really hard to get that full hip extension. We then start seeing the glutes become the predominant hip extensor over a wider range of motion. For the back, what does that do? The muscles of the lower back, they become less active, for lack of a better term. But also from a load management perspective, we shift the way the load is managed from the lower back muscles to the glute muscles. The glutes are far more mechanically, at a far better mechanical advantage to provide hip extension torque versus the lumbar spine muscles. And it's not the fact that I'm saying the glutes shut off totally, because we know that's rubbish. I'm just saying that preferentially the lower back becomes more active in what we prefer versus the glutes. And people will argue black and blue that this stuff doesn't matter, and that's not actually true, and then give their clients glute exercises anyway, and they feel better and they just go load management. We owe it to our clients to dive a little bit deeper in and to actually understand it a little bit more and find the patterns of what we do consistently, so then we can apply it to the next person that we see who comes across with very similar issues. When people go, I don't really care how it works, or it's just load management, we are not putting in enough effort to understand how it works. I don't think it's fair on our clients, and I don't think it's the best way to go about running a business or doing a profession, sorry. And from there, for mid-range, I just use a lot of mid-range exercise for maintaining a training effect. Okay. If someone has an injury, mid-range, you can generally get away with doing that stuff without causing any pain. So if someone has like a bicep tendon issue, doing an incline curl where you put in the strength lengthened position, maybe a bit uncomfortable. Doing a preacher curl may be uncomfortable, but normal dumbbell hammer curl or supination curl can be okay. It's all mid-range. There's no stretch. There's no uh, full contraction period or short position. That type of stuff is okay for maintaining a training effect. But again, I'm applying this to rehab, not getting as jacked as possible. Now, why this matters, if we fix length tension relationships, we get better force production. There's a ton of research that kind of dictates that. The easiest way to kind of prove it to yourself is try and throw a ball when you haven't got a pre-stretch of the pec and a pre-rotation of the thoracic spine. It will not go very far. As soon as you get that pre-stretch and you get better length tension relationship, you get better force production. We get better force production when we brace our core, okay? And we actually get that like our pelvic diaphragm and our respiratory diaphragm facing each other. We create a better length tension relationship between all the abdominal muscle fibers. When we have a better length tension relationship there, they brace more effectively. We can therefore lift more weight and create more intra-abdominal pressure. So this stuff does matter. And it's why it blows my mind that people say the postural stuff doesn't matter at all, because not everyone who has thoracic kyphosis has upper back pain. It still matters to getting stronger in the gym and becoming a better performing athlete. And if our clients are going to come to us, we want to always have something to move them forward to, that they want to keep training with us. The reason why people stop training is that they feel they're not getting anything out of it a lot of the time. If it's not financial related or they're moving, it's just they're not moving forward. So people need to always feel like they're moving forward and getting better. It's one of the best tools for retention you can have. So how do we put this into a framework that we can kind of use as a first principles approach, which we keep in our mind to kind of help people go through this? So first principles is a nice thing to kind of think of with any endeavor you do. What are the principles I need to follow to have success in this field? So number one is provide movement options. That's the first thing. So when we're looking at load management, when we're looking at giving people exercises that train the muscles that they don't normally work too much, moving to lengthened position, etc., and then also changing their recruitment patterns that are so solely ingrained, like they use their back rather than their hip extensors, we're providing movement options. We're encouraging variability to reduce overuse and improve adaptability. What I'll do if I have someone who's a little bit like, let's say they've been doing physique training, they're trying to build muscle and trying to get as jacked as possible. Generally, those clients who try and get jacked as possible, they get like jacked up as possible. They don't get really good movement. They don't move very well and they start just feeling sore and stiff because they're so specialized. Adding in just two frontal plane and two transverse plane exercises in 2 sessions a week can significantly improve that option for their client. So a lateral lunge and a wood chop, for example, as 2 options, can help someone actually manage and mitigate that before it becomes painful, because it's enough variability to actually give them more options to move in. It's something I do with a lot of majority of clients, unless they're going for pure, like, I want to get on stage type thing, because then we don't have that much time. Now, with principle number 2, which is coordinate movement options and movement competency, that's when we're looking at, looking at the neuromuscular patterns, looking at the postural patterns, and looking at how well someone does that, and actually rebuilding those from the ground up. And if we develop the stability, control, and fluidity in those movement patterns, we generally see people feel better. You rarely see people with really nice looking lifts feeling pain in those lifts. You generally see a lack of fluidity, you see a lack of stability and lack of control in those movement patterns. And that's where people are getting compensations where they're using the tissues that aren't meant to be used to basically handle the load that something else should be handling. So they're using their lumbar erectors rather than their glutes and hamstrings in a deadlift, as one example. So we start looking at that. So we can assess that with length tension assessments, with postural assessments, with joint by joint approach, and with neuromuscular assessments, and then give the corrective exercises to coordinate those movement options and to create a better foundation. Then you put them in the gym. And again, form makes a difference here. I just think it's like it's crazy that I have to state it, but I have to. From there, amplification, dissipation of force. So optimize force transfer and reduce impact stress. So teaching people plyometrics. Again, looking at the sling mechanisms and the fascial chains and seeing where does someone need help. Do they need improvement of amplification and generation of force? Do they need help in the summation and the actual, force summation is the wrong word, the absorption of force? Summation is when you use multiple muscle groups together to create one giant force output, such as a wall ball, for example. Principle number 4 is enhance your metabolic capacity. Improve tissue resilience through conditioning. Metabolic capacity doesn't just mean how fast you can run, how much cardio you can do. It's basically like, you got to train that tissue to have more resilience. So a trained muscle is going to be a healthier muscle, which is going to respond better due to blood flow, nutrient delivery, nutrient uptake, glucose, up regulation, sodium, water in the muscle, all that kind of shit is really important. So training the muscle has to become part of the injury rehabilitation process, and training the injured pattern is part of that too, because what happens is it enhances the metabolic capacity of that tissue to heal. So if you hurt yourself squatting, you need to squat to actually heal that squat eventually. You need to train those tissues. Now, principle 5, expose to greater challenges. More demanding loads and movement complexity. This is what I call good programming. Okay? It's simply good programming. People will misread this as going from doing deadlifts to Jefferson deadlifts into Jefferson curls. Okay? It's not necessarily that. That can be part of it. What I would look at is, did that client hurt themselves in that? Is that position relative to them getting the outcomes that they want to get? Based on the fact that our training time we have is limited. And this is where we look at things like Jefferson curls and stuff like that. I think they're a fine exercise. I have no issues with them as long as they've got gradual exposure. I don't think they're a panacea. I don't think they're a magical option for everyone. I think for some people they're very harmful. I think for some people they're amazing. So what it is, I would look at an exercise rather than going, all right, cool. I've seen a cool guy on Instagram do this shit. I need to do it with my clients. I'll be like, is the exposure to this exercise going to train the tissues that I want to have? Is it going to provide the movement options? Is it going to actually also enhance the client's goals? Okay. So if I have a client who, they have a limited time frame to train in, is the Jefferson curl going to be my number one option to do that? 9 times out of 10, it's a no. 10 times out, well, one out of every 10 times, it can be really good. And then we'll absolutely use it. And I've got it in programs. I just don't have it in a lot of programs because it's not relevant a lot of the time. And now the last one, and this is where we come all the way back to the biopsychosocial stuff. Let me just click on the next slide just to see if it's actually relevant as much, is cultivate self-optimism and communication. Now, there's all these things here like stress and cortisol and individual liability. I'm going to do other lectures on that, other presentations, because we're trying to go for biomechanics and actually have a framework to work. And then I want to teach all these other frameworks. With the BPS model, a big thing is the psycho, okay? Our ability to communicate it to the client, so principle 6, to help them recover. How we use our language in the whole rehab process, in the whole training process, in when they get their scans, whatever it is, has a huge impact on how the person will cope, how they respond, and how their physiology behaves. And we've seen it all the time. All of us would have seen it when you got a client who has a disc pathology, for example. They go get an MRI and they go, oh, that's it, I'm never lifting weights again. The doctor says you should never lift weights again or something like that. And then you get the other client who literally tears the disc, doing a deadlift, they can barely walk, they piss their pants because they've got like all those symptoms going on, and they're back in the gym 6 weeks later lifting weight. Okay. Very different psychological people behind that, but also how we communicate that is very important. So if we speak to people with this whole fear avoidance, making them think that the human body is fragile, making them scared of movement, making them scared and not confident in themselves, making them basically fear-mongering, for lack of a better term, and not listening to their concerns, that's the other side of this. If we're fear-mongering the whole time, the client is more likely to get hurt. On the flip side of that, and this is the flip side that the industry has gone in, that you can do anything, you can deadlift with shitty form and it'll be fine. That flippant disregarding of the client's actual valid concerns is a major concern of mine, because people need to feel listened to actually buy into the process and to actually start rehabbing and healing. It's really important that they do that. So with our biopsychosocial model, what we want to be aware of is our words hold power. Our words can influence people in a positive or negative way, and how we frame everything we do with our clients is going to have a major impact over time. A simple one is just saying to your clients, carbs after 6 p.m. they'll definitely make you fat. You'll be surprised at how many people who are otherwise very intelligent and make great decisions will just stop eating carbs after 6 p.m. because they're trying to say they'll make them fat. Despite all logic and evidence to the contrary, suggesting that that has zero impact on them, they will look at that and go, well, that's a problem. So we need to be aware that our language around movement does this stuff as well. And that's the framework that I go with, everyone. So I go from a biopsychosocial, I look at everything. Just going to summarize it real quick. I lost it. I summarize everything and start marking down all the things that I can start to affect. Load management, I'll look at, cool, where the tissue, do they have an overall load problem? Do they have an under recovery problem? Do they have an acute or chronic workload issue? And what tissues are actually dealing with that excessive strain? Which tissues are under training and not dealing with the strain? I'll go to the joint by joint approach, look at what's moving too much and what's not moving enough, and then do something to help them move those things in the right way to give them a quick win so they feel better. I'll use movement slings and fascial lines to start optimizing their ability to create and summate force, create and absorb force over a period of time to see, cool, where do we need to actually work on that to get them moving better over the long term, which will improve their athletic performance anyway. From there, I'll look at postural deviations and the Janda approach and all that type of stuff, simply to inform the way I train the muscle group that I'm going to train. Okay, so if I'm going to train their quads no matter what, because you know I want to train their quads, we're going to train their quads. Do I want to focus on them in the lengthened position or the in the shortened position? And you'll find that most of the time you want to train them in the lengthened position for say just for the quads, for example. So I'll actually look at those postural deviations and then go, cool, I'm going to still emphasize that. So what a lot of trainers used to do in the past was go, oh, cool, you got rounded shoulders, we're not going to do any pressing. Stupid. Pressing is mid-range exercise. It doesn't really take the pec into a fully shortened position. It gets a good stretch. Pressing will not pull you forward into that that thoracic kyphosis. That's a respiratory and self-esteem issue in most cases. What I will do is emphasize exercises such as a cable fly with a 5-second pause in the lengthened position to facilitate that person opening up their chest a little bit more because they're getting load, they're getting stretch, they can open that up. So I will use my understanding of the lower cross syndrome, their postural symptoms, and all that kind of stuff to influence exercise choices for their global training effects that I want to maintain, and making sure that I keep the muscles. If I can go to the next slide, if I don't click on the right thing, I can keep the muscles, where is it here, enhance their metabolic capacity. The programming is a simple option of applying progressive overload at the level the client can handle, and then cultivating self-optimism, and by doing that through the entire communication process, the whole time I speak to them, being nearly overwhelmingly positive in most situations and giving the client the faith in themselves that they can do it. And when you combine that with being able to address things systemically and then being able to give them a quick win, it is very easy to get clients to buy into the process that you're doing. And when they buy in, they get better results. Even if you deviate from what would be considered to be the correct approach, they're still going to get better results because their buy-in is so high with you that they're going to commit to it anyway. And the body is a very efficient self-organizing mechanism. So what happens there? They get better. If they think you're great, they refer your clients. You get more money. Everyone's happy. Any questions, team? Before I go lay down.
No, I think it's all pretty like it really flows well into each other. I guess main question would be like when in the process, like would you start to really implement this stuff? Would it be the very like first consultation, or do you kind of like do you go through your testing first and then develop the protocols from there, or like is it just a all the time sort of thing?
All the time sort of thing. And it's a good question. And it will depend on the context of your environment. So for example, semi-private gym, it's hard to do.
Yeah.
It's hard as hell to do. And that's like logistically a challenge. Like, and everyone can kind of understand that. But I'm getting something for like, I've done doing some one-on-ones up where I live now. And this is what I did. So when I see someone now, what I generally do is the first session is purely talking. I just want to talk to the person and understand what the hell is going on. And that's where I'm going to start looking at the biopsychosocial thing and start to piece together my hypothesis, which is everything that is involved in here. From there, I'll do these two things while I'm talking to people. So whenever I talk to anyone now, I'll be taking notes and just trying to figure out what the hell's going on. Then when I go into the assessment, I'm trying to go bang, 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 trying to understand all 4 of those things in the assessment. And then from there, bang, straight to, I will give them, at this point here, I will give them some corrective exercises or small things to do right then and there that I think will have an impact on how they feel, and try and get some of that buy-in straight away. Because if I can get that, like with the last session I did it with in person, I haven't chased any in person for like, it'd been nearly 12 months now. And this client reached out to me from a referral to actually, just because they thought I might potentially be able to help. And when I assessed the person, the first thing I did, I sat there and then I gave them the corrective exercises, and they noticed the difference straight away in how they felt. And that led to the upsell to the other person, the partner, right? Because we were able to get that immediate outcome, it created the buy-in for that person. So as soon as I assess them, if I have the time, and I will generally, the luxury that I have of how I work is I can carve out a longer session for someone. And yeah, luxury slash necessity, we can argue whichever way it is. I will then do all this stuff, like I'll do this straight away, and then I'll use this to write my exercise program. So as soon as I get home and actually speak to that client, I'm going to write that exercise program and then make sure I apply all this stuff. I'll use an example of a client that I'm going to write after this call. Okay. So Sydney-based client, I haven't been able to see him. Actually, I saw him once down here, but it was like, he was down on holiday. It was a random hello. I was said I would come and assess you, but he's like, no, I'm on holiday, bro. Go away. I was like, okay, cool, fair enough. So I came up to Sydney, I saw the guy, and I've been speaking to him a lot. So I know that like already biomechanically, he's got some tissue healing that needs to be addressed. He's got some torn meniscus and some other tears in his knee. He's got a lot of fear avoidance behaviors. He's very driven in biomechanical stuff because his own self-research. He's one of those people who wants to know what's going on. Unfortunately for him, he used to be a client of mine a long time ago, so he learned a lot of biomechanics. They never learnt the psycho and the social part of it, but he's like kind of got a lot of fear avoidance going on, the movement and all that type of stuff. So when saw him, I spoke to him, and what I did is I assessed him through all this stuff here, all these slides. But the main thing I did was the whole time I'm talking to him in a positive way, and then looking at how he manages load in each individual exercise. So I went through everything he did to see what was going on to manage that. And from there, I've rewritten his strength training program. So if I go over what it is on my notes as a rough kind of guideline, what I'll do with this guy and how I've implemented it, if I can find out where I put my damn notes on my phone. He's here somewhere. Cool. He's definitely his glutes. He's really stuck into this anterior pelvic tilt thing. Giving any kind of cook hip lift or any kind of isometric hamstring thing makes his knee feel immediately better straight away. Any kind of co-contraction where we absorb the force between, like, say, his calf, his tibs, his hamstrings, his quads, makes him feel better straight away. So his training program is based around those concepts. Everything else is to give him lengthened position for where he's tight, and then short position for where he's weak, and then mid-range is just for things that we don't actually really care about, but there's no impact there. So his biceps have no problem. So I'm just going to give him mid-range for his biceps. Reason for that is lengthened range position generally have a higher systemic recovery effect. I don't think this, if I go back to load management, this guy, he runs 3 companies. They're worth quite a lot of money. He's stressed out of his brain. So he doesn't get much recovery anyway, and he's already in pain and injured. So I'm going to give all his exercises where they have, apart from the things he really needs lengthened, the lowest amount of systemic recovery needed possible. Because he's so stressed out, and I know from a biopsychosocial perspective, there's so many things that I can't have a positive effect on. There's no point me even trying to do that. So I may as well just reduce his overall systemic stress, at least in the gym, as much as I can.
Makes
Challenging.
sense.
It's challenging. Like it requires a lot more thinking a lot of the time, which is the most challenging activity most of us can do. But it's a really, really valuable tool to use with people, and you spend a bit more time with it. The cool thing is it's really easy to upsell after it as well, which our goal from this process of being a good coach is to be able to, the strategy I like to do is retain. So keep the client in there. Then you're going to get a review, then a refer, then a resell. So this guy is currently, he's been retained now. He's at the review point of things. So when we get his knee done, I want him to do a video thing. I then want to refer, then I want to resell him into either another package or a high ticket package. We won't always need to resell. Hopefully, you just keep him forever. But I'll probably downsell him into a lower touch program because his knee will be okay, and he probably doesn't need that level of supervision anymore. It's just a nice little business model to tie on to this type of process, and we're being really good at stuff. Really good at like, helping the person through the problem. That structure fits in nice to it as well because it's not too pushy.
Yep, totally.
Cool. Mark, any questions? Probably not wearing clothes. I'm kidding. All right, guys, we'll wrap up. Next week, I'll be talking about a lot of the stuff that's actually in slide number 10 and going through all these type of things and going really deep into physiology. So it should be super fun. Any questions, hit me up in the meantime, and I'll speak to you guys soon. Thank you so much for your attendance and attention.
Thanks, brother.
Namaste.